Thank you, Brad. I would like to ask John Guerin and Jim McClure to make a few comments about these times, and then would like to welcome the other half of our honorees, three of our current VMA trustees, Ray Johnson, John Hedges, and Jan Pate, to make some remarks as well.
Does that work? Well, I am the oldest of 9, and when I was assigned to do this, I got many comments. So this is a composite effort. On behalf of the Guerin family, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say some words about Dad. I did some research at the library to confirm the facts. Barbara Bellinger helped me. I had a great time. Read Bobby Raymond's master's thesis and Carol Goodwin's book, and particularly looked through the Oakleys, which was a lot of fun. There was, Lee will know more about this, but there was a Community Relations Commission formed in 1963. It was composed of 15 members, and they were to handle fair housing complaints. However, integration proceeded very slowly. There were 2 village-sponsored house walks for African Americans in 1967. But according to Bobby, there were only 11 black families in Oak Park at the end of 1967, including Harriet Robnett's family and the family of Dr. Percy Julian. Oak Park began to consider the Fair Housing Ordinance. There were a few other villages which had ordinances, but none of those who had adopted ordinances or were considering them were in the direct path of integration in the way that Bob described Oak Park as being. The Oak Leaves is the main source for current news in Oak Park in 1968, and I looked through its editions from January to May. I was struck by the contrast between the courtly, elegant style of the Oak Leaves and the diction that addressed the issues of race in Oak Park. In the January 24th edition, the Oak Leaves' main editorial begins a tilt of the brim toward Fisher, who was then stepping down after 2 terms on the elementary school board. I enjoyed this especially because my dad wore hats, and he would occasionally tilt his brim. That was consistent with the kind of advertisement that was featured in the Oak Leaves. Very elegant women in dresses advertising Gilmore's wares. But the letters to the editorial board were strident. There was a letter about the straw purchases, which some white buyers executed on behalf of black buyers. And it said, if one is out for a cause, one does not sneak one race in to buy and sneak it over to another. One comes out in the open. Why do our officials stand for these sneak tactics? This is the sort of deal that causes hatred. There were 3 open hearings held in behalf of the board about the proposed Fair Housing Ordinance. The first one was in February, held in the auditorium of the Oak Park River Forest High School. 500 people met, 78 spoke, with only 16 opposed. But the Oak Park Realtors were united in opposition, and many other factions opposed it as well. In March, the Oak Park Referendum Group contended that it had obtained 10,000 signatures from among the 36,660 registered voters, requesting that the ordinance be put to a referendum in the Oak Park election scheduled in June. After the village board had conducted the second open hearing about the village ordinance, the federal open housing law passed on April 11, 1968. The federal statute exempted from the law individual owners selling their own homes. This caused a change in behavior among the Oak Park realtors, who were apparently concerned that if the Oak Park ordinance passed this way, individuals would simply sell their houses by themselves without a broker to obtain exemption under the law. As a result, at the third open hearing about the ordinance held by the village board on April 22nd, the realtors proposed their own ordinance, which extended beyond the provisions of the federal law by eliminating the exemption for a single-family owner to sell its own house. In the meantime, judging from the Oakleafs, the rhetoric continued to escalate on both sides. In the April 24th Oakleafs and Oak Park lawyers' letter to the editor in support of the ordinance said, "The opposition bases its arguments on communist paranoia, opinions of expatriates of nations which failed to solve their own problems but are now experts on Americanism, fear, thinly veiled prejudice, and a realtor who supports racism with discredited legalism." He concludes, "When human rights are relegated to second place, the property rights and self-interest ostensibly protected become physically and morally worthless." Monday, May 6th meeting of the village board, at which the ordinance was passed, also took place in the auditorium of the high school. John Doniker was president, and the 6 trustees included Hazel Hansen, George Vishen, Rupert Wenzel, Mark Brooks, and Iz Fixman, as well as Dad. The housing ordinance did not contain an exemption for individual owners. The Oak Park Board of Realtors, in the end, supported its passage. In the process, the board ruled against putting the ordinance to a village referendum. The ordinance passed by a vote of 5-2. Mark Brooks and Iz Fixman voted against the ordinance, saying that they wanted owners exempted and that they supported the referendum. In the Oakleafs, Dad was quoted as saying that the ordinance did not exempt owners because it would be unfair to place the burden solely on the real estate brokers. In the May 8th edition of the Oakleafs, the main editorial attempted to be reassuring that Oak Park wouldn't immediately turn into a ghetto, and that the village ought to turn the page on the issue. But the letters to the editor continued in their strident tone of opposition. One letter said, "It is still and always will be my belief that a forced housing law is indeed just the beginning of a dictatorship. It takes away one's right to his or her own property." On May 15th, another said about the ordinance, "Today, basic rights have been taken from the people of Oak Park. Your rights as property owners and citizens of what I thought was a great place to live have been denied you. Obviously, the few people who sit at the head of our village board feel that they can tell us what we can and cannot do with our homes and property." On May 20th, the supporters of the referendum filed suit to cause the ordinance to be placed on the ballot as a referendum for the June election, but the village board and others opposed the lawsuit, and the petition filed was denied prior to the June election. The VMA nominated a new slate with Dad as president and Hal Herman, Cyril Farwell, Ted Krasno, Cliff Osborne, Tom Sturr, and Ben Thomas as trustees. And in April of the following year, Bob confirmed for me, the VMA won the election over 2 opposing parties, both led by a real estate broker, with a majority of 55%. I remember working as a precinct captain for the VMA and remember the tension in the village. After that election, there were many later challenges, which I'm sure Jim McClure will address, but the immediate crisis had passed. Let me add just a few personal notes for the Guerin family. A number of us attended with our mother the hearings about the ordinance at the OPR auditorium. Our youngest sibling, Liz, was then only 9 years old. Many of the speeches were vitriolic and threatened the board members, as I'm sure the Donikers remember. And 2 of our family remember that one person was physically removed because he took out a gun. In addition, after Dad was